Hey guys, Frank Forte here, excited to bring you a tutorial on drawing Hellboy in Photoshop. A little about me: I've worked as a storyboard artist in Hollywood for about 16 years. Most recently on Guillermo del Toro's 3 Below on Netflix. 3 Below is the spin-off of the award-winning Trollhunters series. I also storyboarded on the Emoji Movie. I worked as an animator on Hi Hi Puffy Amayumi, a show that was on Cartoon Network a few years back. I also was a storyboard artist on Bob's Burgers, seasons 2 through 6, which was really fun. I did storyboards on Despicable Me 2, which was an amazing experience. I also have a true love of horror, and I was lucky enough to work on Truth or Dare, which came out this year. I storyboarded a bunch of special effects scenes there. I also worked on Insidious 4, The Last Key, where I storyboarded a bunch of kill scenes, the monster, and other special effects scenes that were needed. The recently released Escape Room, I did some initial storyboard concepts for the pitch that director Adam Robitel presented to Sony. And some of the people I've worked for are Illumination Entertainment, Sony Pictures Animation, DreamWorks, Cartoon Network, Heavy Metal Magazine, Bento Box, Blumhouse Productions, Dynamite Entertainment, Lego, Marvel, and a few others I can't think of right now. So let's jump right into it. I usually start with an 8.5 by 11 Photoshop file, 300 dpi in RGB. If it's print, you can do CMYK. For this, we'll do RGB. And Hellboy's great, right? I mean, he's huge, he's a hero, he's dark, he's got a great look to him, he's unique, everybody knows who he is, and why not? Hellboy freaking rules. The very first thing I'll do is gather a bunch of reference, go on the internet, look at a bunch of Hellboy drawings, I'll look at the comics, I'll look at the movies, I will look at any kind of fan art, I will look at colors and poses, and just to kind of get Hellboy into my head. I usually like to start sketching with a gray tone, and I will start by just kind of going in there and roughing out the shapes, usually the head, the body, the form. I'll just kind of rough in everything just so I can kind of get the pose down first. I'm going to speed this up a little bit. What I'm using is really just a simple round Photoshop brush with a point at the end. I'll adjust the opacity as I'm working, so sometimes I'll be at 80%, sometimes I'll drop it down to 50%. In my hand, and my left hand is usually on the numbers 1 through 10, which adjusts the opacity as you're working, and also on the brackets to make the brush bigger and smaller if you're unfamiliar with Photoshop. My left hand is usually on the numbers and the brackets as I'm drawing, and I draw using a Cintiq monitor, and I have a monitor to the left of me where I have reference or some music playing or whatever. So I'm working very loose at this point. I'm fleshing in the form, but I'm also going to flesh in some of the detail. So here I'm just adjusting Hellboy's shoulders, because when you look at the comic books, he has these really broad shoulders and this really kind of small head. So when I looked at my drawing, I just wasn't getting the feel of Hellboy. So we're just going to use the warp tool and adjust. Once I have the basic form down that I'm happy with, then I'll go in and start fleshing in a little bit more of the detail around the fingers, around the waist, and just start having a little fun. I do have some Hellboy reference up on my other screen, which I'm looking at, just to kind of take the best things of each different artist's versions of Hellboy and kind of incorporate the ones that I like into my own. So I'm just going to do a little arm adjustment here. It was looking a little stiff, and again, I'm just working on one layer, as you can see in the layer menu, and I'm just kind of adjusting that one layer as I go. Once I feel like the pose is decent, maybe I'll go in there with a little bit of a blur tool or a smudge tool and maybe kind of blur out some of the sketchy lines, because I will end up using this sketch layer in the final drawing, although it will be reduced in opacity, but sometimes I really like to just have those drawing lines in there. Okay, so I feel that the sketch right now is pretty decent. So what I'm going to do is reduce the opacity of the sketch layer and create another layer where I'm going to do more of a final ink. Now for this drawing, I'm going to keep the ink layer kind of loose. I'm not really going to ink it like a comic book with a tight ink. It's going to be more of a loose ink because I want to do some rendering in there. So if you notice, I'm not really outlining everything, and I'm not putting a lot of cross-hatching in there or a lot of detail. I'm kind of just outlining the outside of the form and inking some of the more important line details on the inside. Now, some people would finish the ink before going to the tone, but sometimes I just tend to get anxious in there, and I just want to go in and start toning it. So I'll create another layer under the ink layer and kind of just go in there with a loose Photoshop brush with a point at about 10%, sometimes between 5 and 10%, and just start shading by dotting and moving the pen around a little bit just to kind of get a little form in there. I just want to see what it's going to look like with the lines and see how dark I want to go. So as you can see, the head was not really defined, and I feel like I need to do another sketch layer of the head before I do the ink layer. So what I'll do is I'll make another layer and do like a head sketch layer, just to kind of rough it in because I don't want to start inking it just yet. So I'll go in there with a gray tone and just kind of loosely flesh in the head, do a little bit of shading, but just get it, to where I like it, and it looks good. I think that kind of looks like a cool Hellboy. Once I think the sketch is done, I'll usually reduce the opacity on that and create another ink layer on the top of that and ink over it. I'm the kind of person that likes to sketch, rough it out, maybe do a cleaner rough, and then ink it. So sometimes that's 3 different layers before I get to the final ink. Some people like to just go in and start inking. If you can do that, by all means, do it. I really just come from a school of sketching, drawing, getting the form, refining it, and then inking it. So that's usually how I work. So now that Hellboy's head looks good and it kind of brings the pose together, I'm going to kind of go in and just have a little fun and add some tone and shading. But as I start shading, my ADD kicks in and I go back to detailing. Why? Because I looked at his belt and I was like, I want to draw some freaking crap on that belt. I want to draw some detail and some packs and some weapons and utilities and everything else. So that's what I'm going to do. Utility belts are always fun. I mean, you could just draw from any hundreds of superheroes that have utility belts, get reference there, video games, or I'm just kind of making stuff up out of my head. looking at a little Hellboy reference, and then just kind of adding some other little gadgets and things that I just have, from my head from reading so many comic books. So this stage here is the second cleanup line over the rough that I did before. And the reason I do this, I just like to refine it, usually in 3 stages. A rough, and then the second line would kind of be considered the pencil line, and the third line would be the ink. I just feel that for me, this is the best way to define the form and find the right proportions and anatomy and composition that I'm looking for. And when I'm inking, I just kind of like to ink over a semi-tight line. So I ink using the hard round pressure brush. It's just a standard Photoshop brush. I do have the Kyle brushes and a lot of other brushes which I'm going to experiment with in some other tutorials, but for me this round brush works fine. I like it. It's cool. And this inked line is still kind of a rough ink, but coming from doing a lot of storyboards, the drawings don't have to be so tight, and I've kind of gotten used to doing a looser drawing, which I still call a finish line. But in a lot of inked comics, a lot of people prefer a tighter line, a tighter drawing, and not so sketchy. It's all what you prefer and what you're into. But for me right now, I'm just kind of into this loose, sketchy look. I don't know, it just looks cool. It still has an element of sketchiness to it, but it's tight enough to read. Just something I'm kind of into. So here I'm just going to quickly finish up the inks, and I'm going to kind of go back and do a little detail here and there. Sometimes I really like to go over the outline, the outer edge, with a darker line and keep the inside lines thinner. I might do a little of that here, but not too much. But it does kind of help to define the form, and I do kind of like that look. So I'm just going to kind of finish up the last bits of it, put some cracks in his stone glove, make this kind of look kind of rocky. He'd always add a few dots in there. I always feel like adding a couple of dots, like stippling effects are good for stone. Stippling and cracks in there to kind of sell that as a rocky form. So here I'm just kind of having fun, tracing over my lines, still keeping it kind of loose, going pretty quickly if I can, and just kind of looking over any spots that I may have missed, adding in some inking, defining some muscle tone. Again, in the chest, you kind of have these folds in there. If you look at, muscular people or bodybuilders, you try to get some realism in there, but also it is a comic book character, so you are kind of having some fun with it and blowing it out of proportion. I'm just kind of looking it over and seeing where I need to add a few things if I do. Once I feel the ink is done, I will go back to my shadow layer and go in there and quickly try to add some shading. So here I'm just doing a general shading pass. My light source is basically going to be coming from the right, but I'm just doing a general shading pass where I kind of define some of the shapes. The lower edges are usually shadowed. I will probably do the pants a little bit darker, but I'm using just, your standard Photoshop brush, which is like an airbrush at about 10%. Sometimes I'll go to 5%, and I just kind of go in there and try to make little shapes and dots and circles and try to make it not look so airbrushy if I can. although I don't know if I'm succeeding here as much, but I think that's okay. I think it still looks kind of cool. So I still am showing my sketch layers underneath, but sometimes as I do the shading, I'll drop those down a little bit, and I will also blur those layers, the sketch layers that were there. I'll blur them and smudge them so that they still exist under the drawing, because sometimes I kind of like those sketch layers under there. They kind of give the drawing some emotion, and they kind of, I don't like to lose the feeling and the energy I had when I was sketching, so I'll just leave a hint of them under there. Once I feel the shading is done, I'll get ready to add the color. And what I normally do is I will use the select tool and select around the image and create a base color. So for Hellboy, he's red. I will create a base color of red. For his skin, and what I'll do is I will sometimes adjust the saturation a little bit so it's not so saturated. So the skin will be one layer. His shorts will be another layer. His belt, which is brown, will be a layer. And I think the gun, the little tip of the gun, which will be like a gunmetal gray, will be a separate layer. So that's how I'll separate it into basic colors for the base colors, which I will paint over later. But I'll leave these on separate layers, and I'll usually name the layers, just so for myself. I'm not someone that likes to work and keep flattening layers and work on one layer. I find that very difficult, and it's very hard for me to change things. Some people like to work that way. I prefer to keep a lot of things on layers. I always work with a lot of layers. I do merge certain things, but I feel that I can keep it to a minimum, and I do a lot of times name layers so that it doesn't get out of hand and I know where things are. So here's a basic another layer for the cross and the beads, and I'll go in and fix anything that might have been overspray, or if I have to go back in and erase and make everything nice. Oh, and the eyes too. The eyes will be another layer as well. So I'll kind of cut those out and give them a layer where on the layer I'll also draw the pupils and the detail of the eyes later. Once the basic color is down, I'll start to add some highlights, and after looking at some color reference from some Hellboy films, it looks like Hellboy will be highlighted in oranges and pinks. So I kind of go in there at 10%, really lightly, and just start highlighting some of the forms, the top edges of the muscles, with kind of like a red-orange. So I just quickly do a pass over his entire body with a medium, I guess I would call this a medium highlight. I'm just kind of working in the basic highlights, and I'll go in there and put more detail later. But I just want to see what it looks like if it was, a little bit lighter. We'll add some detail, and I'll go in there, and sometimes I'll leave the brush tones, but I'll smudge it out, blur it, Again, looking at lighting reference from Hellboy just to see how he's lit. If I had a maquette and I could light it myself, sure, that would be ideal. A lot of people work that way, but you can get it pretty close. So then I'll go in and add some highlight detail, the finer points of light. It'll be a little bit lighter, maybe a little bit more yellow. And I'll just add some, little points of light where the light would be brightest. Um, you know, working my way around his body, hitting the muscles, the arms, the legs, kind of defining where the highlights would be. When I do the clothes, his shorts, and the leather, I'll usually select the surrounding color, make it a little bit lighter, and maybe add some yellow. It's always good to add some light in there if it's a warm light that's hitting him, and not to just go with white. It's always good to add color. Light has color, so you should think about what color the light is that's hitting him. So I'll just add some, quick highlights, smudge them out a little bit, and just define the forms. If you're having trouble with lighting, you can always look online. There's so much reference now online. Just look up army belt, utility belt, any type of uniform, police belt, and if you can't find it lit the way you want, you can always look it up in Maya or ZBrush and create a form and light it. I mean, there's so many things to look at. For me, I'm just kind of doing it quickly. I'm not going for photorealism or perfection, so I'm just kind of going in there and having a little bit of fun. Now for the face, I go in, I zoom in a little bit, and I just kind of use local color and a reference of a shadowed face and just try to add some detail with the light source coming from the right. I'll add some highlights where I feel are the high points of the face and just try to work it in there to make it look semi-realistic. After the highlights are completed, I always like to add some other color in there for the shadow side, which is usually a light color. Blues or purples work well and kind of adds a little life to the picture if you have, a light coming from the other side, like a 2-point lighting system. So I'll go into the dark areas on the left-hand side and add blues and purples and try to mix them up a little bit so that it could be, it just defines the form on that side. And usually what I'll do is if I add purple or blue or the other light source, I will also darken in the area between the highlight and the color. And usually if you look at something when it's lit, you usually have this darker area in between the highlight and the color. So here I'm just kind of still using the basic Photoshop brown brush and just kind of going over the dark areas just to kind of define the shadows and also adding in highlights on the left side, the other light source. Just kind of touching up, just looking over it, getting near the end. So just kind of having fun with it now, Detailing is always a fun part of the process, You can noodle it, you can get in there, you can really render stuff out here and there. I'm not a huge renderer. I like to leave it a little bit more painterly and have the brush strokes in there, and it's always going to be a little loose when I do it. I never really get to a photorealistic type final. It's just not the way I do things. I think I would drive myself crazy if I had to do that every time. But much respect for the people that do it, because I'm not there. I can't do it. I don't have the ability. So now comes time for some of the fun detail. If you look at a lot of HELLBOY pics, he's got a lot of veins and scars and little indents, battle scars on his skin. So you just kind of go in. This is with like a dark red color. I'm just going to do kind of like a rough veins, and then I'm going to leave some room on the other side for a highlight. But just kind of going in there and, you know, adding veins and detail, and, you know, adding some highlights, again using like the yellow highlight color for that. Hellboy in a lot of the movie images that you see has a lot of scars, so I'll go in there and add scar tissue, you know, again, dark red, some almost black but not really, and then add some highlights on top of the scars if they're sticking out. I'll look at some scar tissue for a little bit of reference, just to see how scar tissue is lit, and just kind of have fun, you know, drawing what I think are slashes from demons, or sword scars and knife scars and bites from paranormal creatures. So just basically having fun at this stage. Another little bit of detail that I like to do in the end is I like to bring some splatter in. Now, a lot of these splatter effects are actually made with a toothbrush with black ink. So I'll splatter black ink on a piece of 8.5 by 11 paper, and then I'll scan it in. I'll bring it into Photoshop, and I will separate it onto a layer so that it's clear, and then I'll adjust the color. So I'll have red, black, and sometimes a highlight layer of splatter. I like splatter because it kind of gives the digital image a feeling that it was made traditionally, and it goes back to looking at Simon Bisley's stuff where he would use a toothbrush for when he would paint with acrylics, and I kind of take the splatter and add it into the shadow areas, but you can also add it to the highlight areas. It could be used for all sorts of things, but it does give the character a little bit of texture, and that's why I like it. So what I'm doing is I bring in the layer of splatter, I call it, and I use the rubber stamp tool to kind of select different areas of the splatter and put them where I want, which is in the shadow areas of the muscles, in the face, and a lot of times I'll make that layer a multiply layer, so that even if I have the red splatter on the dark area, say the pants or something, it will blend into the pants and not be so red. But here you can see in a close-up, I'm just sampling different parts of the splatter and putting them all over different parts of Hellboy's body, and you can see the splatter kind of turning up, and in parts where it's too dark, I'll just go in and erase it. Like in his shorts, I felt it was too dark. I'll go in there and erase part of it, just so it kind of fades out a little bit. Make it a little more subtle. Other parts I'll go in there and I'll blur and I'll smudge, just to kind of give it a little bit of a different texture. Now for the background, I'm going to use a bunch of grunge textures, and these I just found on the internet. So I'm going to find 3 different grunge textures and kind of merge them. So the one on top, the second layer will be like an opacity, and maybe I'll multiply that, and then the third layer I'll multiply that, so that I'll get a blending of the 3 different layers, and then, you know, it's kind of my own design in a way. If I had the time, I'll usually create this myself using paint, scanning it in, multiple layers, but this is a quick way to do it if you're stuck for time. So then you can see that Hellboy kind of pops. And then what I'll do is I'll kind of just take a lighter color that I'll sample from the background and kind of give them a highlight. Again, this is a kind of a quick way to kind of make him stand out. If you're doing a cover illustration, you probably wouldn't want to do this. You'd probably want to put him on, you know, a better background or something, or, you know, you could use the dodge and burn tool here. I mean, you could do all sorts of things, but I'm just kind of outlining him quickly to make him stand out. Again, using the smudge tool and the blur tool to kind of get rid of those lines in there. So, and then here I will add the splatter layer, but make it white, or I'm really trying to get it close to that tan color that the outline is. So I'll get it as close as I can, and then maybe I'll do a multiply layer, reduce the opacity so some of the color comes through, and then kind of sample the splatter around Hellboy, and then smudge it and blur it so it doesn't look so I want it to kind of blend in so it doesn't look so, I guess, splattery. So, you know, I could spend a little more time, you know, making the splatter on the sides and the highlights, but I'm just kind of running out of time, so I'm just doing it quickly. So we'll zoom in for the eyes. I'm going to use like a lighter red for the outline, and then get in there with kind of an orange and a yellow for some highlights, and then a darker, I would say a black or a black red for the pupil, and then you can always go in there, you know, add whatever you want for the iris, but because it's so far away, I don't think it's really necessary at this point. So at this point, I kind of call it done, at least to the stage I want. Of course, you could go in there and render it more. I could work on the background, but at this point, that's a quick render of Hellboy. You know, subscribe. We're going to be doing a lot more videos. We're going to be doing a lot more tutorials on storyboarding, illustration, comic book, mainly dark art, creatures, of course, monster creation. So come back and check us out. Thanks.